When I was in college, I shared a small off-campus apartment with my best friend Jamie. We were both a bit unconventional, preferring quiet nights and quirky adventures over the usual party scene. One cold October night, restless and bored, we decided to take a late-night walk around the neighborhood. It was past 2 a.m., and the streets were eerily silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. As we wandered past a row of dimly lit shops, we saw something that made us pause. Lying in the gutter was a large black dog. Its fur was matted and dull, and its body was unnaturally stiff, the kind of stillness that comes after death. There was a dark, greasy stain beneath its head, making it clear that it had likely been hit by a car. Jamie knelt beside it for a moment, shaking his head. "Poor thing," he murmured softly. We didn't linger long. The sight was unsettling, and there was nothing we could do. With heavy hearts, we continued walking, eventually finding ourselves at a small park a few blocks away. The park was quiet and deserted, with the swing swaying slightly in the breeze and casting long, eerie shadows under the dim streetlights. We sat on a bench, talking about nothing in particular, simply enjoying the stillness of the night. After about an hour, we decided to head back home, retracing our steps. As we neared the spot where we had seen the dog, a car passed by, its headlights slicing through the darkness. That's when we saw it, the same black dog, alive and moving slowly across the street. Its gait was strange, almost like it was limping, and its shadow stretched unnaturally long under the streetlight. Jamie froze mid-step. "Did you see that?" he whispered. I nodded, my mouth dry with unease. We rushed to the spot where the dog's body had been, expecting to find it still there, but the gutter was empty. Only the dark, greasy stain remained, glistening faintly under the light. The dog's body was gone. We didn't say much on the walk back to our apartment, but the air felt heavier, as if something unseen was watching us. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the dog hadn't been dead after all. Maybe it had been stunned and somehow managed to get up and walk away. But that explanation didn't sit right. Its body had been so stiff. It hadn't been breathing. That strange encounter was only the beginning. A few nights later, Jamie was out with a friend, and I was alone in the apartment trying to study. The building was old, with thin walls and creaky floors, so I was accustomed to odd noises. But that night felt different. I kept hearing faint scratching sounds at the window, like claws dragging against the glass. At first, I dismissed it as the wind or a tree branch, but when I looked outside, there was nothing there. Just the empty street, dimly illuminated by the orange glow of the streetlights. I closed the blinds, trying to ignore the sound, but the scratching continued, soft but persistent. It wasn't until Jamie came home that it finally stopped. "Anything weird happen while I was out?" he asked, tossing his jacket onto the couch. I hesitated, then shook my head. No, nothing. I didn't want to sound paranoid or crazy. Over the next few weeks, the dog started appearing more and more. One night, Jamie and his friend were walking home from a bar when they swore it chased them down the street. Another time, I saw it sitting under a streetlight across from our apartment. Its eyes reflected the light in an unnatural way. It didn't bark, didn't move. It just sat there watching. We started hearing rumors too. A neighbor mentioned seeing a black dog roaming the area late at night. Our resident assistant even left a note asking to speak with us. When we knocked on her door, she led us back to our apartment without explanation. Once inside, she looked around at the mess pizza boxes, laundry, half-empty coffee cups, and frowned. "There's no way you're keeping a dog in here," she said firmly. Jamie and I exchanged a glance. "We don't have a dog," he said slowly. The raw raised an eyebrow. "One of the groundskeepers said they saw a black dog in your window the other night." We didn't argue. What could we say? We just nodded, waited for her to leave, and locked the door behind her. The final straw came one night in November. Jamie and I were sitting on the couch when we heard a low, guttural growl coming from outside the window. My stomach dropped. Jamie stood, his face pale. "Stay here," he said, grabbing a flashlight. He approached the window cautiously, pulling back the blinds just enough to peek outside. He froze. His body stiffened, as if he'd been turned to stone. "What is it?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Jamie stepped back, letting the blinds fall shut. "It's out there," he said, his voice shaking. "It's just standing there, staring at the window." We didn't sleep that night. We kept all the lights on and stayed in the living room, jumping at every little sound. By morning, the dog was gone, but the sense of unease lingered. Jamie moved out a few weeks later, saying he couldn't handle the weirdness anymore. I stayed until the end of the semester, but I was never comfortable in that apartment again. Something about that dog felt wrong, like it had left a mark on the place and on us. When I was younger, I wanted to prove to myself and my parents that I could live independently. They believed I wasn't ready, but I was determined to show them otherwise. I rented a small, clean apartment through Airbnb. It was in a good area, and everything seemed perfect at first. I unpacked my belongings, set up my things, and began adjusting to life on my own. However, it didn't take long before strange occurrences began disrupting my new life. At the time, I had my little son, Adam, with me. He was a toddler, full of energy and curiosity. Adam loved playing with his toys, babbling and laughing, even though most of his words weren't clear yet. One day I heard him laughing and chatting in his room. Curious, I peeked in, expecting to see him surrounded by his stuffed animals. Instead, he was sitting on the floor, staring at a blank spot in the corner. Though his words were hard to make out, it sounded like he was having a full conversation. I asked him, "Who are you talking to?" Adam turned to me, pointed to the corner, and said, "My dog, Kay." At first, I didn't think much of it. Kids have wild imaginations, right? But the next day, something unsettling happened. Adam began yelling at the same corner. His little face turned red with anger, as though he was arguing with someone invisible. I tried to calm him down, but he kept pointing at the corner and shouting, "Bad. Go away." That night, I woke up feeling a strange pressure on my chest. It felt like something heavy was pressing down on me. I couldn't move or scream, and the experience felt too vivid to be a nightmare. When I finally snapped out of it, I looked at my arms and saw red marks, scratches running along my skin. I couldn't explain where they had come from. Over the following nights, the experiences worsened. I'd wake up gasping for air, new scratches and bruises appearing on my body without explanation. During the day, I worked night shifts at a government building with my mom. The building had security cameras installed in the parking lot, and employees could watch the footage while waiting for their shifts to start. One evening, I glanced at the monitors and froze. On the screen near my car was a large black figure. It wasn't a person or an animal. Its shape was vague, almost like a dog, but it had no distinct features, just a dark, blurry outline. The figure moved low to the ground, almost slinking as it circled my car. I tried convincing myself it was just a shadow or a trick of the cameras, but deep down, I knew better. The next night, the figure appeared again. It followed the same pattern, stalking around my car as if it was waiting for me. It ignored the other cars entirely, fixated on mine. I didn't tell anyone about it. I wanted to handle it on my own and prove to myself that I wasn't scared. When I returned home that night, the apartment was eerily quiet. For the first time in weeks, I didn't wake up with scratches, and the nightmares seemed to stop. I thought perhaps the black figure had stayed behind at work. But I was wrong. My mom lived out in the countryside with my grandparents. Her house was about a quarter of a mile down the road from theirs, connected by a narrow, overgrown path through the woods. It was about half a mile if you walked through the woods. One evening, I decided to visit her. As the sun began setting, I entered the wooded trail. At first, the walk felt peaceful. The air was cool and the trees cast long shadows over the path. But halfway through, an uneasy feeling crept over me. It started as a sense of being watched. The woods were silent, but the rustling leaves and snapping twigs seemed louder than usual. Then, I heard a low, guttural growl. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. The sound was deep, rumbling, and filled with anger. My heart pounded as I turned to look behind me. Standing at the edge of the trail, half hidden in the shadows, was the black figure. It looked exactly like the one I'd seen on the security footage. It had no eyes, no face, but I could feel its gaze boring into me. Its body rippled like smoke, shifting and moving while remaining in place. Fear gripped me, but I forced myself to keep walking. Running would only provoke it, I told myself. The growling grew louder, and I could hear heavy footsteps crunching the leaves behind me. It was following me. My chest tightened as every instinct screamed at me to get out of the woods. I didn't dare look back again. My legs trembled with each step, but I kept moving forward. Then, it let out a howl, a sound I'll never forget. It wasn't like any animal's howl. It was long, deep, and filled with an almost tangible rage. The trees around me seemed to close in, and I knew in that moment that if it caught me, I wouldn't survive. Somehow, I made it to my mom's house. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands shaking. My mom looked at me, startled, and asked what had happened. All I could say was, "Something's in the woods." Her eyes widened, and she nodded. "I've seen it too," she said. She told me about the black figure she'd seen on the cameras at work, describing it exactly as I'd seen it. The realization hit me like a wave. This thing wasn't just in my imagination. Whatever it was, it had followed me home. For weeks, I stayed with my mom, too afraid to return to my apartment. Eventually, the scratches stopped and the nightmares faded. But even now, I can't forget the feeling of that thing in the woods or the rage in its howl. In December 2019, I was living alone in a small, quiet house on the edge of town. It was a peaceful neighborhood, and I cherished the solitude. My only companion was Max, my loyal German shepherd who had been by my side for years. Max was my protector and friend, a comforting presence in the long, cold evenings. That month, the nights were particularly harsh. Frost clung to the windows, and the chill seemed to seep through every crack. I often spent my evenings wrapped in a blanket, watching TV to pass the time. Max would usually sleep beside me, his steady breathing a reminder that I wasn't completely alone. But as December wore on, Max began acting strangely. Every night, almost like clockwork, he would get up around 2 a.m., leave my side, and head downstairs. There, he'd start barking a loud, insistent bark that cut through the stillness of the night. At first, I thought he was reacting to noises outside, perhaps raccoons rummaging through garbage or stray cats prowling the neighborhood. But this wasn't a one-time occurrence. It became a pattern. Night after night, at the exact same time, Max would bark at something I couldn't see. It unnerved me. Max wasn't a timid dog, and his barks weren't fearful. They were sharp and alert, like he was warning something or someone to stay away. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was nothing, but the unease lingered. The silence in the house seemed heavier, and the nights felt colder. I started dreading the sound of Max's claws clicking on the wooden floor as he made his way downstairs. One particularly frigid Friday night, I was in the living room, trying to distract myself with a movie. Max was lying at my feet, his ears occasionally twitching at the sound of the TV. I glanced at the clock. It was 1:58 a.m. Right on cue, Max stood up, his ears perked. But this time, instead of heading to the living room, he walked to the basement door. He stopped there, staring at it intently, and let out a low, rumbling growl. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I muted the TV and listened. Max started barking loud, sharp barks that echoed through the house. His body was tense, his nose almost pressed against the basement door, as though he was certain something was behind it. My heart began to race, and a cold dread settled over me. What was he seeing or sensing that I couldn't? Grabbing a flashlight from the coffee table, I slowly approached the basement door. My hands were clammy despite the cold, and the air felt thick and heavy. I hesitated for a moment before opening the door, just enough to shine the flashlight down the stairs. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the cluttered basement. Old boxes, broken furniture, and scattered tools filled the space. At first, everything seemed normal. Then I saw a shadow. It was quick, fleeting, moving behind a stack of boxes. I froze, my mind racing. Was it an animal? Could someone have broken in? My instincts screamed at me to run, but this was my home. I couldn't just leave without knowing what or who was down there. Instead of going down alone, I called my friend Luke. Luke was the kind of person who never hesitated to help and was braver than I'd ever be. When I explained what was happening, he didn't laugh or dismiss it. He just said he'd be over in 10 minutes. Those 10 minutes felt like hours. Max stayed by the basement door, growling occasionally. I sat on the couch, gripping the flashlight tightly, jumping at every little creak and sound. When Luke arrived, he wasted no time. Armed with his own flashlight, he gave me a reassuring nod, and together we opened the basement door. Max followed close behind, his tail wagging slightly now that Luke was there. We descended the creaking wooden stairs, the damp air thick with the smell of mildew. The beams of our flashlights swept across the room, illuminating nothing but the usual mess of forgotten junk. Then we saw him. Behind a stack of boxes, crouched on the floor, was a man. He was thin, his clothes tattered and dirty. When our flashlights landed on him, he flinched, raising his hands as if to shield himself. "Please," he said, his voice shaking. "Don't call the police." "I'm sorry, I'll leave." Luke and I exchanged uncertain glances, unsure of what to do. The man began to cry, his words tumbling out in a desperate rush. He explained that he wasn't a criminal, just a man who had lost everything. His wife had died earlier that year, and the grief had consumed him. He lost his job, then his home. One cold night, he found my front door ajar and decided to sneak in, just to find a warm place to sleep. "I didn't mean to scare you," he said, tears streaming down his face. "I only came out at night to get food from the kitchen." I'm sorry. His story hit me hard. The thought of calling the police crossed my mind, but looking at him, I couldn't bring myself to do it. He wasn't dangerous, just a man at the end of his rope. I told him he didn't need to sneak around anymore. Luke and I helped him upstairs and gave him some food and a warm blanket. He ate ravenously, apologizing between bites and promising he'd leave and never come back. But I couldn't just send him back into the freezing night. Instead, I gave him some money and drove him to a nearby shelter where he could get help. As I dropped him off, he looked at me with tears in his eyes, thanking me over and over. That night, as I returned home, the house felt quieter than it had in weeks. Max curled up at my feet as I sat on the couch, exhausted but relieved. I couldn't stop thinking about the man, about how easily life could fall apart. Since that night, I always double-check my doors before bed, but more importantly, I've tried to hold on to a little more compassion. Sometimes, all someone needs is a bit of kindness to find their way again.